This case has the potential to end the internet as we know it. The internet flourishes on user-generated content. It's the backbone of the internet. And if you write or say something that is illegal, you can be held liable for what you said. But usually the websites that host your content
Yep, Section 230, baby.
And when you hear about Section 230, this is usually what we're talking about. But if websites were also liable for what users say, then websites would either shut down almost everything or police things so tightly that there would be basically nothing even remotely objectionable.
And that's exactly what I was saying when we were first talking about the case, but chat assured me that it was only going to be affecting like recommended videos or algorithmically generated videos. And I told you that is just not the case. If any Section 230 protects the platform from what the users post. So if some absolute unhinged maniac is posting some shit, or like very morbid example, like when there was a mass shooting that was streamed on Facebook, Facebook is not responsible for that mass shooting being broadcast, and that's mainly thanks to something like the 230 protections. But if those go away, Facebook is now responsible for that. So what happens as a result, if the platforms are held responsible for every single thing the users post on there, they're not going to let users freely post. That's just how it will literally get rid of user-generated content.
Because if there's one thing that websites hate, it's being on the hook for billions and billions of dollars of potential liability and attorney's fees. And this isn't just some potential hypothetical. In the past, when laws made websites liable for user content, they just shut down the content and never came back. And one case before the Supreme Court this term seeks to do exactly that, but for all of the internet. No joke, this has the potential to end the internet as we know it today. So how did we get here?
How did I get here?
Well, it started with a tragedy. Noemi Gonzalez was a design major at California State University Long Beach who was spending a semester studying in Paris. On the evening of November 15th, 2015, she was dining with friends at a cafe on the Champs-Élysées when an ISIS terrorist with a gun opened fire. Gonzalez was killed along with 130 other people in coordinated attacks at 6 locations across the city. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attacks, and eventually 20 men were convicted of crimes related to the massacre. The lone surviving gunman was sentenced to life without parole. So, was justice served? Well, the Gonzalez family contends that it was not because there was another perpetrator still at large: YouTube. The family sued Google, which owns YouTube, alleging that YouTube's algorithms amplify violent videos and hateful content despite the company's efforts to ban violent accounts and limit their reach. The Gonzalez family says that YouTube's recommendations expose people to hateful content, radicalize viewers, and encourage them to make terrorist attacks of their own.
Which is an argument that's been made for quite some time, and one of the biggest shortcomings of like YouTube's algorithm and recommended videos that's been critiqued for a while. So basically the argument boils down to, thanks to the way algorithms work and what gets recommended, you end up sometimes falling into this weird rabbit hole where you're going to get recommended some shit that gets shady, and then if you accidentally or you somehow do venture over there, you're going to then be locked into more and more of that content. Thus, they make the argument that it can radicalize people and end up in a situation like this. That's kind of the backbone of it. So they're blaming the platform because it does introduce you to the very harmful shit that exists on there. And they're arguing that they should be held responsible, and that targets the Section 230 ruling. Is the resub slam. And the tier 1 head. If you see a pro-terrorist video and decide to become a terrorist, you're probably bound to do it anyway. That's not exactly how it works, man. I feel like we're in the age where most people probably have a better understanding of how that kind of shit happens. Like, you see it on Twitter all the time. Like, you can actually see it happen in real time with some YouTubers. For example, here, let's take... Who's a good example? We'll do H3H3. You can see like a steady change in how H3H3 approached content and his online presence. It was subtle changes and then eventually leading to huge changes. You can appreciate the changes or not appreciate them, it doesn't matter. But over time, as he became exposed to more and more things that were pushed towards him on the platforms, you can see them change in real time. It's not like a flip of a switch where like H3H3 watched one video, he fully agreed with it, and then all of a sudden all of his beliefs changed. It's a change that happens over time. Some positive, some negative. So in this case, they're arguing it about being extremism. It's not just like found one thing and it's your fault, you are already going to become a terrorist. It's you saw one thing, and maybe you weren't interested at first, but then as more things got recommended and you ended up getting curious and clicking, it started to change your perspective. Very rarely is it just like a flip of a switch. It's over time. So the argument is, as YouTube keeps when this happened, YouTube kept recommending all of this extremist content, it was changing people, radicalizing them over time, and eventually leading to this tragedy. That's the argument. It's not just, oh, they were already going to be terrorists. They clicked on a terrorism video and then all of a sudden became one. It's not YouTube's fault. It was the argument of they kept bringing it and it kept getting pushed to them. The argument could be made for the opposite, though, making people better. Absolutely could. 100%. I used H3 as an example. You could think his change is 100% a positive change. You can argue it's good or bad. Absolutely. But the case is about a very extreme example where it was very bad. Thanks to the resub Nameless, Kolbson, and Thick. It's a Supreme Court case, Sylvie. It's hard to explain. We're at the beginning here, so Legal Eagle is going to absolutely break it down much more thoroughly than I can in a nutshell. But it's a pretty big deal. And by pretty big deal, I mean like it's actually a very big deal. It sounds like an excuse for money. I don't think they gain anything out of it. Let's assume they win this whole thing. I don't think they get like a monetary gain. What it would do is it would take down those protections, which pretty much nukes most websites. Thanks, Resub Panda. And the Bits Mage. They gain control over internet media. You realize that this isn't like a... Hold on. Let me pull it up so I don't get that wrong. So this case is called Gonzalez versus Google, and Gonzalez, like that group that is coming after them, is not like some kind of media company. It's not like they're trying to take control of YouTube and all of that. They really do believe that the Section 230 has led to extremist content radicalizing people. So it's not really like a money or control play, at least not from everything I've read about the case. Thanks to the resub Pokemon. And the resub Crest and Tier 1 James.
Google argued that because ISIS, not YouTube, made and uploaded those videos, YouTube was not the provider or developer of those videos, and therefore it was immune from liability under 47 U.S.C. Section 230, otherwise known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 of the CDA immunizes internet services for the content that its users upload, and often allows websites to remove content without taking on liability. But the Gonzalez plaintiffs contend that YouTube's recommendations should not be covered by Section 230 because the company is acting like a content creator rather than a publisher.
Which I don't really agree with.
The Gonzalez claims fell within Section 230 and Google was immune from suit. The Gonzalez parties appealed and the Supreme Court granted cert to answer the question of whether Section 230 immunizes an interactive computer service from liability for recommending other party content. Now, in support of their claims, plaintiffs allege that, quote, 2 of the 12 ISIS terrorists who carried out the attacks used online social media platforms to post links to ISIS recruitment YouTube videos and, quote, jihadi YouTube videos. One of the men who fired at Gonzalez had appeared in an ISIS recruiting video in 2014. Now, the plaintiffs argue that the defendants violated the Anti-Terrorism Act, the ATA, by allowing ISIS to post videos on YouTube. Under Section 2333 of the ATA, as amended by the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, Americans who are injured by, quote, an act of international terrorism that is committed, planned, or authorized by a terrorist organization may sue any person who, quote, aids and abets by knowingly providing substantial assistance or who conspires with a person who committed such an act of international terrorism and recover treble damages. So the legal question in the lower courts was whether a social media platform that was not used to commit a specific, quote, act of international
should be held
terrorism
liable for
may
the
still be
recommendation.
liable for aiding and abetting under Section 2333. The plaintiffs say that the answer is yes, that Google aided and abetted an act of international terrorism, conspired with the perpetrator of an act of international terrorism, and provided material support to ISIS by allowing ISIS to use YouTube.
So again, it ties into the recommendation. The argument is, even if they weren't making the content, by facilitating it, by pumping it out through the recommendations, where you get a ton of that content pushed on you the second you click on something, thanks to the algorithmic generation of like recommendations, they're arguing that they acted as a content creator by providing it to them. Thus, it shouldn't be subjected to the 230 protections because they directly contributed. They were basically functioning as less of a publisher and more of the creator side, which I just don't really agree with. Thanks to the resub. Moist Nath and Tier 1 Auntie. There was, and probably still is, I haven't heard about it in a while, a real problem with like terrorist groups using YouTube for recruitment. And YouTube had those videos up for a long, long time. Like, they didn't get taken down. They didn't get taken seriously. That is a real issue. And by having those fly under the radar for so long, it spawned an entire community, which was listed there with, like, the jihadi YouTuber community, which is crazy that it actually existed, but it did get people radicalized. And that content was recommended once you clicked on one of those videos. So that's where the whole issue stems from. I think the optimal solution would be to just prevent that content from existing on YouTube. Like, there's gotta be some way in fucking 2023 to recognize and get rid of content like that. That would have solved the issue 100%. Instead of targeting like the overall protections of Section 230, which are invaluable to the internet landscape. Thanks for the resub Pigeon Commander and the resub Red Rhino. And the bits that guy. And the resub Tux. With AI, they could do it. You're not wrong. AI would probably be an extremely valuable tool to combat that. Thanks for the gift sub Henry. And the resub Gonzo. YouTube just too big to lose. That's what everyone likes to think, but in a case like this, when you have what is a very real terrorist incident that happened as a direct result of being radicalized through YouTube videos for some of the attackers, that's a very scary thing to the people in charge. That is something that they would absolutely act on out of fear and immediately start taking like massive swings without realizing the ramifications. This isn't something small or something silly. This is huge. Yeah, Hades is a great game though, Fate. Hope you're enjoying it. And thanks to the resub Letho and Epinephrine and the bits Craig. I don't know Craig, I haven't seen him talk about the M&Ms. And thanks to the resub Bungshire.
And of course, the defendants say no, the plaintiff's claims are barred by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which often immunizes interactive computer services, aka websites, even when they make targeted recommendations. The trial court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals sided with Google, ruling that the claims fell within Section 230, Section C, because ISIS, not YouTube, created or developed the relevant content. The court said that YouTube, quote, selects the particular content provided to a user based on that user's inputs. The display of recommended content results from algorithms that are merely, quote, tools meant to facilitate the communication and content of others, and not content in and of themselves. As the lower courts noted, the recommendations are based on the user's preferences, not YouTube's. The plaintiffs argue that Section 230C does not apply to, quote, activities that promote or recommend content. So let's dig deeper into what all of this means. First of all, the plaintiffs are not simply arguing that platforms are liable because terrorists have used their services. They argue that the powerful algorithms that recommend content are not covered by the CDA because the recommendations are content in and of themselves. And as the Ninth Circuit said, the complaint alleges Google uses computer algorithms to match and suggest content to users based upon their viewing history. The Gonzalez plaintiffs allege that in this way, Google has recommended ISIS videos to users and enabled users to locate other videos and accounts related to ISIS, and that by doing so, Google assists ISIS in spreading its message. So the plaintiffs claim that YouTube facilitates communications between ISIS and people who watch their videos, thereby aiding ISIS in recruiting new members. The plaintiffs acknowledge—
Which is a very, I mean, that is true. They are not wrong. Everything they said here is correct. Which is why it's such a fucking tricky case. That is 100% accurate. And this was an issue for a long time. If you click on one of those videos, you will get recommended the entire community of videos, which legitimately does assist in spreading ISIS messaging and radicalizing people. So they are correct.
Recruiting new members. The plaintiffs acknowledge that YouTube removed ISIS videos and suspended or blocked ISIS users at various times. However, the plaintiffs claim that YouTube should have been able to stop ISIS from re-establishing accounts using new identities. And the plaintiffs allege that Google left some of the ISIS videos up because they did not contain content violating the site's policies. At other times, Google removed the offending content, but did not suspend or ban the accounts. Now, we've talked about Section 230 of the CDA many times on this channel. Section 230 was created back in 1996 at the dawn of the internet. It has two key provisions. Section 230C1 says, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. This sentence is often called the 26 words that created the internet. This section stipulates that providing access to third-party content does not make an online provider the publisher or speaker of that content. Now, the second major part of the law is
which I feel like a lot of people these days don't realize, especially with like Twitter and shit. There's very real problems on Twitter, especially with like pedophiles and shit. Like that needs to be taken down. But when people put it on Twitter's back, like Twitter is a platform that promotes pedophilia and shit, is always a bit overstated. Like when you try and put it on the company, like YouTube needs to get taken down because of the ISIS videos, for example. It's not a good argument to make, and you wouldn't want a world where Twitter, YouTube, whatever, is responsible because of those people using their service. Because in that case, nothing would be able to fly. If they're going to be held liable for every lunatic that uses the platform, and they're going to be the ones getting targeted, they won't allow anyone to post things without heavy scrutiny from an entire council that approves it beforehand, meaning any type of freedom to post is gone. It would be just completely evaporated. They wouldn't allow it. Thanks for the resub, Mitch. And Tier 1, Sebastian. The news has literally worked this way forever. Kinda. Would TikTok be affected? Everything would be affected. If Section 230, for some reason, they start poking holes in it, or somehow, like, get rid of it entirely, every single social media site, well, really, like, pretty much any site at all where users can post, would be gutted overnight. %.
230C2, the so-called Good Samaritan provision, which states, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be held liable on account of any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. So this provision gives online platforms broad immunity from liability if they moderate content in good faith. This provision was meant to allow websites to police itself without incurring new liability, because it was an issue of knowledge. A website might not know what speech was hosted on that particular website, in which
I think the world would be better if social media was down for a bit. That's a very short-sighted thing. I think one thing that Twitter has been invaluable with is information, to a fault almost, with an information overload. We can now easily tell when major media outlets are lying, such as with Sam Bankman-Fried, where it was all fluff pieces about him not being a fraud and all that. We can easily see when they're not talking about things, such as the train derailment in Ohio and everything like that. So should all of this get overturned, Section 230's gone, you won't have Twitter. You won't have user-generated content. It will be gone. And then you are completely at the mercy of all of the corrupt mainstream media outlets that can easily feed any narrative to you at all, and you will never be able to fact-check it because that doesn't exist anymore. You wouldn't know. That's for everything. That's Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Anything where users post content would be gone. There's so much misinformation on Twitter, though. Same as in mainstream media outlets, too. There's misinformation everywhere. Which is why the onus needs to be on you to do enough research to figure out what's real and what's fake. This is the resub Nick. Will this affect the world or just the US? Well, so far it's affecting neither. Like, it is still, it's not, nothing's been put into place. This is all just like worst case scenario. Should the worst come to pass from the Gonzalez versus Google case and the precedent it sets, as well as what it does to Section 230. It's just analyzing like what could happen in the worst case scenario, and it would affect everything. Almost like the root cause of all social media being bad is the people using them. Yeah, but it's also the best thing about social media as well. Again, I wouldn't want to go back to a point where the only information you have comes from the major media outlets, which are all owned by like the same three people, like the Rupert Murdochs and shit, which have proven time and time again to be highly corrupt. I think that'd be awful. Thanks to the resub Planet, Invicta, and the Prime Fruit. Super villain-ass name. It is a pretty fucking super villain-esque name. YouTube isn't liable for this. Not yet. That's what the whole argument is about. Will they be held liable for the extremist content that was being recommended to people that actually did radicalize some of them and led to the 2015 terrorist attacks? Yes. That's what the whole thing is about.
In which case they wouldn't be liable for it. But if they knew that illegal speech or defamatory speech or some other kind of speech was hosted there and then took steps to remove it from the website itself, then they actively had knowledge of that particular speech and thus might become liable for hosting it in the future. So websites found themselves on the horns of a dilemma until Section 230 of the CDA was passed to allow them to engage in good faith moderation. Because there was generally a knowledge requirement to be liable for things that were hosted on your website. If you had no knowledge of what kind of speech was on your website or platform,
Metal
then
and
you
Resub
generally
Jane
weren't liable for it. But the argument went that if you started to moderate your website, then that was evidence that you knew what was on there, and therefore you became liable for all the stuff that you were trying to remove from your website. This applied to spam, to pornography, to pirated media, to defamation, you name it. So the CDA was enacted in 1996 when the internet was still in its infancy. At the time, companies like America Online, CompuServe, and Prodigy were the portals that allowed people to access the internet. People could share files, exchange messages, and chat with each other in real time. But that posed a dilemma. Who would be liable if a user posted something defamatory or shared something else that was illegal? Would liability go beyond the person that was responsible for the post? Or would the internet companies who hosted the content also be on the hook? And that brings us to the distinction between content publishers, distributors, and platforms, which is often completely misunderstood. In the pre-internet age, publishers, distributors, and platforms were treated differently under the law. Publishers were newspapers, magazines, and broadcast stations. They were generally liable for republishing material from third parties since they solicited the things that they published and they could vet those materials. Distributors were businesses like bookstores, newsstands, and libraries, which distributed material that was printed by others. And distributors were not required to assess every book that they sold. For example, in the 1950s, the Supreme Court overturned a Los Angeles ordinance that said, if you have obscene material in your bookstore, you can be held criminally responsible. And in that case, a bookstore owner was convicted of violating the ordinance by selling a novel called Sweeter Than Life, which tells the story of a, quote, ruthless lesbian businesswoman. The Supreme Court said that the bookstore couldn't be responsible for reviewing every single thing in the book or magazine that it sells. And distributors only had liability if someone notified them that something they carried was illegal. That's sort of the origin of the knowledge requirement. And platforms were common carriers like phone companies
Which makes
and
sense.
television broadcasters. Platforms,
I mean, that makes total sense. Not knowing everything that's going into it, that's fine. Being made aware of it, recognizing it as a problem, and getting rid of it, that's like the natural course of things, and that's just kind of the way things have worked for quite some time. I'm surprised that happened all the way back in the fucking 1950s, Christ. Thanks for resub Jingle Bug, Donut, and the Prime Humble. Hope you're doing well, Donut. So is this an attack on free speech? It's an attack on anything user-generated. Like anything user-generated is what this would affect from any platform that allows users to generate the content. So by extension, yeah, obviously. Thanks for resub Grotesque. Thanks for resub Saturn. Why can't the government just let us live our lives? Oh, I'm sure you know the answer to that one. But in this case, it is actually in a very tricky situation. There was a very real problem. One that got pointed out a lot. YouTube had an issue of housing and recommending ISIS recruitment videos. They had an entire jihadi community on YouTube. And they didn't act. And what happened is, it tragically led to a fucking terrorist attack from people who were radicalized through the YouTube content that was algorithmically recommended to them. That is what stemmed this whole thing. That's why it's so fucking weird and tricky, because it was a real issue, but I think they're targeting the wrong thing by expanding it to what could be extremely detrimental to the most important protections the internet has, which is Section 230. It's not just a case of them trying to meddle in our lives at this point. This one literally was a problem. But I think they're targeting the wrong thing about it. Thanks to the resub Eclipse in the Prime Forgot. What solution would there be to the problem? They want an actual solution. If this is the only way to solve it, they'll probably do it eventually. Which is a scary thing to think about. Like I said, the solution is tighter moderation on extremist content, clearly. But given the size, the scale of YouTube, I recognize with common sense that is too big. That's too many things to review. Which is why AI could be instrumental. AI could do that. AI could solve that problem if YouTube was given the incentive to push that and have that work for them. That would be the solution, as opposed to just taking down 230. This is the Prime Slacker. Do they have the incentive? Oh, I'm sure now they do. With this, I think so. I wouldn't be surprised if they really went hog wild with like AI moderation tools to tackle extremist content on the platform. Yeah. Fuck yeah. Thanks for the bit, Sylvie. And who decides what is extremist, though? My guy, I think there's some very obvious ones, like, and you did mention it. I didn't read the rest of it. Some of it's obvious, but some of it's more subtle. You're not wrong, but I think even just starting with the obvious is a great start. Like, the jihadi community literally was called the jihadi YouTube community, where they had literal ISIS recruitment videos. I've seen a couple of them. They were actual, like, Windows Movie Maker things sometimes, talking about, like, information to learn about joining ISIS as well as fighting for ISIS, this kind of thing. Like, that kind of shit existed for a long time and got recommended to people. This was a problem people called out for quite a long time. And it persisted. It should have been easy, assuming the AI gets there, to recognize that as, wow, blatant extremism, that's a problem. Thanks to the bits dumpy. There was tons of it. Thanks to resub robust. And getting rid of 230 would do nothing to solve it. It actually would, though. That's why they're going for it. If their target truly is 230. Getting rid of 230 means no users will be generating content because it's too risky for the platforms to allow them to freely. So you wouldn't ever see anything that wasn't heavily curated by the platform itself because they wouldn't want to be liable and be opening themselves up to a lawsuit. Right? So it would solve it, but with an absolute nuclear bomb. And take everything else with it. I know AI is not good enough yet, but it can be, and will be.
Weren't liable for third-party content that they carried. So, for example, let's say AT&T found out that someone's answering machine had a libelous outgoing message. Was AT&T required to act by canceling the owner's telephone service? Well, the court said no. AT&T couldn't be sued for libel simply because the owner used its service to say something libelous. And similarly, a broadcaster wasn't liable for running a political candidate that falsely accused someone of being a communist. But then the internet came around, and the internet era posed a new challenge for this case law. Two of the first internet service providers, CompuServe and Prodigy, were sued for hosting forums where users posted defamatory content. Now, Prodigy billed itself as a family-friendly version of the internet.
Did you get a computer recently? Well, congratulations. You can now join
Man, I haven't heard the name Prodigy in fucking years.
Prodigy.
It moderated comments, removing things it thought were bad. Now, CompuServe didn't moderate anything.
CompuServe combines the power of your computer with the convenience of your telephone.
And both of those companies were sued for defamatory statements that their users posted to the service. Now, the case against CompuServe was dismissed because the court considered it a distributor of content rather than a publisher. CompuServe could only be held liable for defamation if it knew or had reason to know of the defamatory nature of the content. And since they didn't do anything to moderate their forums, the company couldn't possibly know, or at least argued it couldn't possibly know, about what the denizens of Rumorville were posting about each other. But Prodigy was found liable for failing to moderate
because of their
enough.
moderation.
Someone went on a forum
they
and
were
claimed
aware.
that Jordan Belfort's investment firm, Stratton Oakmont, committed fraud in connection with a stock IPO. The firm sued Prodigy and the anonymous poster for defamation. And a court held that Prodigy was liable as the publisher of the content created by its users, since it exercised editorial control over the messages on its bulletin board. Now, if the names Jordan Belfort and Stratton Oakmont ring a bell, that's because they were literally scamming people out of millions of dollars and have gone down as some of the biggest fraudsters in all of Wall Street history. The movie The Wolf of Wall Street is based on the fraud that they were perpetrating with respect to the IPOs. And it's one of the biggest ironies in all of First Amendment law that they won this lawsuit against the people that were hosting presumably accurate information about how they were scamming people out of money. That's part of the problem when websites are liable for user content, is that people can file lawsuits to stifle speech. That's what a slap lawsuit is all about. And because lawsuits are incredibly expensive, sometimes even if you scammed people out of money, as long as you file a lawsuit, you can stifle that kind of speech. But I digress. As a result of these cases, internet service providers basically either decided to not moderate at all and leave absolutely everything up, or basically moderate everything and not allow anything to go up. And basically no one was happy with this state of affairs, so Congress enacted the Communications Decency Act. And then, as now, lawmakers claim to be especially worried about things like harassment and obscene material. So they gave online providers immunity from lawsuits if they moderated content. And again, the irony here is that this legislation came from the sort of family values type politicians, the people who always want to think about the children.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
They wanted to allow websites to remove violent and sexual conduct so that the internet could be even cleaner.
Super squeaky clean Weenie Hut Jr.
Got the little parental advisory explicit content warnings put on rap albums. But I digress again. Section 230 was intended as a way for internet companies to create and enforce basic standards to run their websites. And when the CompuServe and Prodigy cases were decided, the courts only considered whether the ISPs were publishers or distributors. But an internet service, like a website, didn't fit neatly into those categories. A traditional publisher has total control over whether to publish.
I had no idea this is why that act was started.
What it buys, but
this is so fascinating.
Practical for a human to fully screen every item. Modern social media companies host more material than any library or bookstore on Earth, which makes screening all of that info daunting, if not impossible. And without Section 230, social media companies would be subject to strict liability for every message and post made on their services. So Congress chose to give those platforms and websites immunity as an incentive to get them to remove offending speech. Congress also chose not to dictate to those companies which speech they had to remove. So that brings us back to the original question in this case. How should courts read Section 230? The lower courts follow the test set forth in the Ninth Circuit case called Barnes versus Yahoo.
Damn, so that really started in a really different way. Wow. I mean, shit. The most important law ever put into effect for the internet spawned from something very different. Yeah, unintended consequences, but it was the most beneficial thing for the internet. Without Section 230, the internet as it stands currently would not exist, and would have never existed. I knew about the lawsuit with the moderation because the argument, like, logically makes sense. If you don't moderate anything, it's plausible deniability. They didn't know anything bad was there. We can't hold them accountable. They get off. But when you do moderate, and you strictly moderate, and something bad's there, well, now that excuse no longer flies because you must have known it was there, thus we're going to fuck you in the mouth. So then there's only ever two camps of complete free-for-all Wild West, and then Weenie Hut Jr., heavily moderated, every single piece of content needs to be looked at through a magnifying glass. Which led to the creation of Section 230. And suddenly they're then liable for DMCA and not just content creators, for example. I don't think they are, though. What platform has been held liable for DMCA? In the early days of YouTube, I remember there was almost a case like that, but I'm pretty sure it was ruled in YouTube's favor. Why is every American afraid of confirming who they are with their passport? It always hurts me seeing how people don't value any level of privacy anymore. Reading things like that is painful. There was a time not too long ago when learning that people were spying on you or anything like that was alarming. But now we just welcome the invasive privacy violations for some reason. It's so weird. He's Tier 1 Holly and Resub Haley. Everyone has your data. I know, man. We lost that privacy war so fucking badly, unfortunately. What a shame. Every single thing collects data. It's so bad. Ugh. And no one cares anymore. Does anyone remember, this is going to be a deep cut. I think it was probably about 12 years ago now, maybe a little bit longer. There was a big report that came to light about phones listening to you. People started recognizing that ads were curated to conversations you were having without ever putting anything into the phone. So like even if you weren't directly looking up things, it would still somehow be able to give you ads about things you talked about. And this was very alarming to a lot of people. This was like a big red flag back then. Like, holy shit, they're listening to me and giving me curated ads. This is a complete violation of privacy. And it became this big hoopla. And then it just vanished. And now everyone's like, oh, that's great. Hey, I was actually just talking about this. Thank you for listening, Google. Bang. And then bye. It's wild how quickly things shift around. I remember my mom crying when I was in a chat room playing games in 2004. Yeah, I remember that too. There used to be this very obvious rule on the internet of don't tell anyone anything. But now it's actually just tell everyone everything or you're a fucking weirdo. It's fucking crazy. Like if you don't tell everyone everything, if you don't give all of your personal information to every platform you sign up, you must be some kind of terrorist or something, or you're hiding something. It's so weird. That's completely off target from what the actual case is, though. That was just ancillary because I saw someone ask why people are opposed to giving their passport when signing up to websites, which I think should be obvious. He's a Prime RJ, the resub Spavari, and the Prime Raider. Has there ever been a court case where law enforcement used the listening devices to get targeted ads to confirm a crime was committed? No, but there have been plenty of cases where authorities have used similar tactics to know that someone was a threat, and then they still let the threat continue. Pretty much every mass shooter, like the FBI comes out and is like, yeah, we actually knew this guy was 100% going to do that. Like, we had a ton of information and a ton of reports on this guy. Like, we did know this was coming. Shame what happened. But yeah, this is a very serious case. I really hope that it does not go in favor of the Gonzalez group. If this all goes down for the worst, what would your first action be? Well, I don't know, man. That's a really hard thing to even picture because it is scorched earth. If 230 goes down, it actually is scorched earth for the internet as a whole. His title is not clickbait. It's not exaggeratory. It really is that serious. I highly recommend watching Legal Eagles content surrounding it to go over like the whole scope of the situation. These resubs Sync, Alexis, and Stony. Stumble Guys time? Yeah, Matt just texted me they're ready, so we're gonna play some Stumble Guys. It's been too long. There's a tier 1. Tabby. Getting rid of 230 isn't the apocalypse. You're saying it'll be YouTube, Instagram, Facebook aren't going to shut down user content that'd kill their business and just force their hand to more heavily moderate. No, it would actually kill their business. It wouldn't do it overnight. They'd try and somehow come up with a compromise, but if you are held liable for everything users post, you will not let users post without heavy scrutiny and going through your own verification to make sure it's safe, right? And that's a ton of users. You can't do that. You're going to have to shut it down completely. Because if you don't, you're going to be held liable. That's absolutely what would happen if 230 goes down. It'd be a complete disaster. Yeah, I'm hopping in, Matt. There's no, like, half measure you can take. They'd have to. Otherwise, they'd be liable anytime someone trolls. Like, before I hop in the call, if you wanted to, if 230 goes down and YouTube still somehow tries to make this work, you could completely fuck them. Like, if you somehow get, like, a checkmark approval, like, you're a verified poster, you can post. Like, if you somehow get that permission, you could fuck the entire company by just posting, like, join ISIS. And then what would happen is YouTube would be held liable, and then bang, they're on the hook for $1 million lawsuit, millions upon millions of dollars. They wouldn't have protection anymore. So they wouldn't allow it. Just like they didn't back in this time that he's talking about with, like, heavily moderated content or Wild West. What up, boys? Make sure to smash that like button and thumbs up, ring the bell, tell your mom I said hi. Yeah, that's about it. See ya.